How's it going, guys? Today we're going to be talking about the best films of 2024 by category. Now, if you've seen my top 10 video earlier on the channel, you know that it was a very difficult job narrowing it down to those 10 titles. So today we're going to have a more expansive list. We're going to be covering a bunch of different genres and what movies I liked in each genre. This is all subjective, of course. These are all movies that I enjoyed, that I recommend. Of course, feel free to comment your favorite films of 2024 down below. But with that being said, let's dive right into this list. And the first category that I will be covering is comedy. For comedy, I had Saturday Night. I really enjoyed the production, the humor, and this recreation of what made Saturday Night Live so special. I also enjoyed Hundreds of Beavers. This was a very refreshing and original film that brought a lot of creativity despite its limited budget and resources. Dee Dee was another really good film, a feel-good coming-of-age story. But my favorite film of 2024 in this category had to go to A Real Pain. Really great performances. Kieran Culkin is excellent. I thought the humor and the more emotional moments really balanced this film out superbly. Really great movie. I highly recommend A Real Pain. Next category is rom-com. Now, if you know me, rom-com is not a genre that I particularly enjoy. You know, sometimes it does surprise me. This year, I really enjoyed Hitman. I think that was a superb comedy, and just I love the chemistry in this film, and it's just it was a fun time. I saw it twice, so I really recommend it. But my favorite rom-com had to go to Anora. This was a really funny film in the second half of that film, and also really like the performances, really like the story. It just had a lot of different elements that made this film work that initially when it started, I didn't think that those were going to combine very well because these characters are not the most likable. But by the end of this film, I was smiling. I really liked the turnout, and it's a hell of a ride. Next category is romance. For romance, there was several titles I wanted to include. Luca Guadagnino's Queer, I enjoyed. Definitely something that's different, but with each passing act, I feel like this film got better and more interesting, especially the last act. I definitely wanted to include that in this list. Love Lies Bleeding was a very surprising film. I really enjoyed this, from the performances to the story to the villain, the editing and the lighting. Really great looking movie. But my favorite romance film of the year might not be the most conventional romance film, but nonetheless is a love triangle drama, and that is Challengers. This is also my favorite film of 2024. I absolutely love the energy this film brings, the score, the editing is amazing, the performances are excellent, and I love the structure of this film that has you guessing what is going on in each character's head the entire time. Next on the list is horror, and this is probably the most controversial genre for me this year, because as much as I think the genre was incredible for the year, I also have quite a bit of hot takes for the genre that a lot of people, loved some movies that did not make this list. So if you're expecting movies like Longlegs to be on this list, I couldn't do it. I could not add that movie to this list. And Nosferatu, that's another one. So the cinematography, I cannot deny, is really good. I like the tone of the film as well. But in terms of the movie as a whole, I did not really care for the movie a whole lot, so I couldn't recommend it. So those two movies just did not make my horror list of the year. But I do have quite a bit of titles here that I do want to recommend. And we'll start things off with Speak No Evil. It's a remake. I do like the ending more in the original, but as a film as a whole, I enjoyed it. I think it's a fun time. Late Night with the Devil, another movie that I had low expectations for and came out thinking it was quite a solid film. Oddity, great small budget film that also surprised me in the year. Smile 2 had no business being good, and somehow I enjoyed it. It made my honorable mentions list in my top 10 list. I think this is an improvement over the original film, which felt very conventional. But as much as I disappointed, I feel like a good number of people in the horror genre, with not including Longlegs or Nosferatu, I feel like I'll get some credit where it's due with The Substance, which is my favorite horror film of the year. This is an experience. It is the wildest and most memorable horror film, I think, of the year, and I don't think it comes to any surprise that it is #1, because it's also being nominated for a couple of Oscars. It's such a different and refreshing film that it had to make my top. Next up is period drama. We'll start things off with The Brutalist. This is a movie I thought was just alright. I didn't hate the movie, I didn't love the movie. I think there's a lot of technical aspects of this film that are incredible. I like the score. I also really appreciate the filmmaking because it's very old school and it's not a movie that we really get a whole lot. So I do respect what it's going for. Firebrand, I feel like not a whole lot of people check this movie out. I enjoyed it. I can't say it's the most amazing thing, but it is really good. Gladiator 2. I do have some gripes with this movie, but as an entertainment spectacle, I cannot deny that this was a very enjoyable movie with really great costume design and production design, and it brought that period to life very well. September 5. Also, talking about bringing events to life, this does an incredible job of doing that as well, and bringing that tension in a one-room setting. But my favorite period drama, as we already talked about this film earlier, had to go to Saturday Night. This is a really good comedy. It really shows you why Saturday Night became so special, and the hectic disorganization paired with the humor and the performances, I think made this a very enjoyable film, and which is why it is my favorite period drama of this year. Next category is sci-fi and fantasy, and when we're talking about sci-fi and fantasy, there's really only two movies to talk about this year that just stand far from everybody else. And that, of course, is Dune Part 2, and I really enjoyed this film much more than the first one. But, you know, number one had to go to Furiosa. I feel like this movie didn't get any attention because the box office numbers were kind of terrible, and the snubbery that happened at the Oscars with the nominations, Furiosa is nowhere. It's insane to me because Furiosa was such an incredibly immersive experience with incredible production value and just effects and costuming, and I don't know why nobody really picked this movie, but it's a movie I had very low expectations for, and those expectations were blown out of the water because not only was it my third favorite film of 2024, but it was also my favorite sci-fi fantasy film of that year. So Furiosa, do check this movie out, give it some love. It is on Netflix. Next category is action. I do want to recommend Rebel Ridge. I think the first act is actually very good, and then the last 15 minutes or so are also very good. The middle act does struggle a little bit, but it's a very solid action film that took me by surprise. I enjoyed it. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I went in thinking this was going to be a terrible movie. It obviously doesn't hold a candlelight to any of the previous Planet of the Apes films, but it is nonetheless an entertaining action film that I did enjoy. Twisters, another movie that I thought wasn't going to be that great. The trailers were kind of selling me, and by the end of the day, Twisters, I really enjoyed. I think it's much better than the first film. Next up is Gladiator 2. Like I said, it's an entertainment spectacle. There's just no denying that the action is what is selling everything. And Ridley Scott really wanted to sell the action in this film because he jam-packs this film with so much, throwing things left and right in this movie to keep you immersed in the story that it's telling. But of course, like I said earlier, with the sci-fi and fantasy genre, Furiosa was such an experience that it left such an impression that I really think that it was my favorite action film of the year in terms of the thrills and the filmmaking itself. Next up is anime slash Dong-ua. I wanted to split this up, which is why you saw this category last year, because last year there were so many anime titles that I wanted to recommend. And there was also, you know, a decent amount of animated films that came out in the United States that I wanted to mention. So I wanted to split the genres up kind of. And this year, there wasn't a whole lot happening in the anime world. I know a lot of people enjoyed Look Back. I didn't get a whole lot out of it. There was also another anime film that came out, Haikyu. It's based on the series. I never got into it. I know it's about volleyball, and I just know personally, sports anime is not my thing, so did not check it out. So based on the titles that I did check out, Spy Family was going in the right direction. I know the show was kind of going downhill in my opinion, but it was solid. Nothing like spectacular or anything. So for this category, I have only 2 movies to recommend, and that is Mononoke the movie, The Phantom in the Rain. This is based on the TV series that I never watched, but I am curious to now because the movie was actually quite solid and it stands on its own. I really like the animation, the voiceover work, and the story is pretty interesting too. But my favorite in this category is going to have to go to The Colors Within. I know this is a movie that kind of came out in October, but is also now coming in theaters now. But I kind of wanted to include this movie on this year because most of the people I follow on Letterboxd did have this logged back in October. But this stood apart from all of the films I've seen in this category this year. I think that it's got superb animation and really good voiceover work, and I really like the messages and themes that this movie was covering, and it was just a touching story. It was very entertaining, and I liked the music in this film quite a bit too. So The Colors Within was my favorite anime film of this year. Next category is animation. For animation, I had to include Orion in the Dark. I really like the premise of this film. I do like the animation and the voiceover work. I also wanted to include Flow because this is a really nice animated film as well. And while I do think it was stretched a little bit thin, I did appreciate the filmmaking, and it's a small little movie. Like, I wanted to show it some love because I did enjoy it despite, having some issues with it. Transformers 1. This movie had no business even making this list, but this movie surprised me. As much as I am not the biggest Transformers fan, this might be one of the best Transformer movies I've seen. Like, seriously, this was a fun film. I mean, it was geared towards children, but there's enough here for adults to enjoy as well. Wallace and Gromit. I've always been a fan of the movies and the shorts, and this doesn't do anything that it hasn't done before, but it is very enjoyable, it is humorful, and I've always appreciated this form of animation, and I had to include it on the list. Wild Robot, another film that surprised me. I did not expect to like this movie. The trailers were not selling it to me, but this was a touching film with really good animation. But my favorite animated film of this year had to go to Memoir of a Snail. This is, yes, it's an adult film, so I wouldn't recommend it to children, but this is such an emotional roller coaster of a movie. It's a thematically rich film that's addressing depression, anxiety, and acceptance. And it's a beautifully told film that I think a lot of people need to check out. Definitely my favorite animated film of 2024. Next category is documentary. I try to fit in as many documentaries as I can. It's not my go-to genre, and some documentaries are just hard to find sometimes. For example, No Other Land I was trying to watch, and I couldn't find it anywhere. So that's probably coming out much later, right before the Oscars. So I really only watched like 3 documentaries this year, and the only one that really stuck out to me was the Superman documentary about Christopher Reeve. I think this was a well-told story. It covered his life really well. It was touching, and yeah, I mean, I couldn't complain. I think it was the most well put together documentary this year. The next category is Best International Film, and there's quite a bit of titles in here, so let's get started with Emilia Perez. This is the most controversial, film that's being discussed right now. People seem to be giving this movie a lot of hate, but I, unlike some people, enjoyed this movie. I don't think it deserves as much hate as it's getting. Seed of a Sacred Fig. Evil Does Not Exist. Really good too. Perfect Days. It did come out earlier in the year, but it made enough of an impact for it to be quite memorable, and I wanted to include it in the list. Maharaja, this is an Indian film. Now, Indian films are very hit or miss for me. Sometimes they get really over the top, but when they're more grounded, I do enjoy them from time to time, and Maharaja was a pleasant surprise of the year. Next up is Red Rooms, an incredible thriller. I enjoyed this immensely, from the acting to the editing and just the tension that this brought. This was to a Gone Girl level of tension. I really enjoyed this movie. But my favorite international film of the year had to go to The Peasants. This is a Polish film. I think this is a movie like no other. I mean, if you want a movie that is like a giant painting, I know we talk about movies where each frame feels like a painting. This movie legitimately is a painting. And if you see the movie, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, because it really is a stunning work of art, and it's the one that stood out the most for me this year. Next category is thriller. For this genre, also good number of movies that I want to recommend, and With this genre, let's start with Heretic. I think this was a really enjoyable film. It felt very much like an Alfred Hitchcock film at times. And, you know, as much as I wasn't a huge fan of its ending, I was on this film's wavelength for most of the time. Blink Twice, another awesome thriller and amazing directorial debut. Maharaja, we talked about this film, really good. I think this brought tension throughout and it had me guessing along the way the entire time. The Substance, I mean, do we have to say anything? Love Lies Bleeding, also really great amount of thrills in this. I enjoyed this quite a bit. Strange Darling, I don't feel like a whole lot of people were talking about this, but this movie really just hit it out of the park with its structure and constantly having you guess where it's going. That structure really is what made this movie, but it really captured the suspense when it needed it most, and it's one of the best of the year. Adding more titles from the international genre, of course I also had to mention Red Rooms. But my favorite thriller has to go to Conclave. This was a movie where I was constantly questioning its direction and what was going to happen because there was so much deceit and each character had their own motives and all these conflicts that are happening in addition to that score that is being played really just make this a just tense ride the entire time. Conclave, highest recommendations, one of the best movies of 2024 and my favorite thriller of the year. Next up is Westerns. This is my favorite genre, and unfortunately, it's a genre that's all really hit or miss these days. Last year, there wasn't a whole lot to choose from. This year, slightly more, but kind of a subpar year really for the genre once again. I have 3 movies to recommend. Obviously, I'm going to talk about Horizon because this is a very expansive film. It's very epic. It's not a Western we get a whole lot. So as much as I had problems with this movie, I do appreciate the filmmaking and the ambition that went into making this movie, and I hope the second part is a lot better. The Thicket was probably the best true Western we've gotten this year. I think Peter Dinklage is really good at it. I like the tone of the film. And I think the story is interesting enough as well. But it was not my favorite Western this year. That had to go to In the Land of Saints and Sinners. It's a neo-Western with Liam Neeson. Now, Liam Neeson, you know, he's very hit or miss, mostly missed these days with movies, but which is why it's surprising that this movie was good, because I honestly went in thinking, oh, here we go, we got another Liam Neeson movie, but this was actually really good. I enjoyed this movie. It feels very much like a mesh of Banshees of Inisherin with No Country for Old Men at times. So I think the performances are good. I think the tension is there when it needs to be. And the story is unpredictable throughout. So I think this is the best Western I've seen this year. It's not a true Western, but the best of the genre that had to be offered this year. The next category is Best Biopic of 2024, and there were 2 titles that I really wanted to talk about. I will mention A Complete Unknown. I do have issues with this movie. I don't think it's a complete bomb of a movie. I do think it's well told. I think it is a crowd pleaser, but this is not a movie that has a whole lot of rewatchability or paints Bob Dylan in this like incredible fashion, because Bob Dylan is a huge name and this movie didn't really make me think a whole lot about Bob Dylan. So from a cinematic point of view, it is a well shot movie. The acting is good, but nothing incredible, but enough to recommend. And The Apprentice, that's going to be the one that I have to say is the best of the genre. Again, the performances are really good, the production values are high, and the story is really gripping. And amongst all of the biopics this year, this one captured me the most and just kept me engaged throughout the entire runtime. Next category is Best Musical, and this was a category that I struggled a lot with in the year. I couldn't come up with a whole lot of titles. For the longest time, I had, you know, Wicked was not something I enjoyed. The End, I like its ambition and its premise, but it kind of failed as a musical for me. And some of these other titles like The Lion King or Moana 2, they just didn't do it for me either. They just kind of fell flat. So in terms of musicals this year, I have a couple that I will mention. Musica it's a solid film. I really like the creativity that's behind this movie, and that's what's really the selling point, because the romance aspect of it, it's all right, but it's the humor and the editing that makes this movie stand out slightly. So I do recommend it. Joker 2, I know this movie got a lot of hate, but from a cinematic point of view and like the editing and the costuming, I think this is a really good movie. I just think it's not like that great of a musical. I think the music aspect was a letdown, especially when you have talents like Lady Gaga involved here, and she's not much of a factor here, like her performance or the music. It's kind of a letdown. So the movie obviously is not as strong as the first film, but yeah, there's still some merit here. I did enjoy it. I didn't love it, but it is quite solid. But my favorite musical of the year had to go to the most controversial movie of the year, and that's Emilia Perez. You know, it did rack up 13 nominations, but I was not expecting that to happen, honestly. When I saw this movie, I didn't even think it was going to be mentioned at the Oscars, but here, long and behold, we are here, and it's getting a lot of hate. Do I think it should have gotten 13 nominations? Probably not, but I do enjoy this movie. I think it's a flawed film for sure, but I enjoyed it. I think it's the best musical we've gotten this year because this genre is lacking on movies with memorable scores and tracks, and this was the only movie that really stood out to me in this genre. So Emilia Perez, you know, not perfect movie, but I did enjoy it. Next category is book to movie adaptations. This is a new category I added to this video, and there were a good number of book to movie adaptations. We'll start off with Nickel Boys. This is getting some award recognition, of course, and I think it's well deserved. I enjoyed the story here. I thought that first person structure was going to fall apart, but it got better as the film went along. I think this was a really well told movie. Three Musketeers, Milady, which is the sequel to the first Three Musketeers film from 2 years ago. I think this improved the characters. I think while it didn't have as much action per se, the writing was better. The characters were fleshed out better. So I did end up enjoying this. Next up is Count of Monte Cristo. I was not really planning on watching this until like I started seeing more people talk about it and how much they enjoyed it, and I'm glad I did. This was a very entertaining movie. Conclave. This is based on a book. Of course, I had to include it in this category. But my favorite book to movie adaptation is gonna have to be Dune Part 2. I think this movie did a good job bringing that book to life, like more than I ever thought it would. That's why I have it higher than Conclave, though Conclave I did enjoy slightly more than Dune Part 2 if you look at my top 10 ranking. But yeah, Dune Part 2 was a very immersive film, and I really enjoyed the storytelling there. Had to put it as my number one. Next category is Best Debut Film. This is another new category I added to the video. There's quite a bit of titles here. Let's talk about some of these titles. Anna Kendrick for Woman of the Hour. I enjoy this movie. I think the last third of the film is a bit of a letdown. It's almost like a summary of the things that happen. I just thought that was a cop-out ending. But everything leading up to that ending was really good. So I was very impressed by Anna Kendrick's debut. Rachel Morrison for The Fire Inside. Also, really superb sports drama. I enjoyed it. Next up, Sam H. Freeman and Ng Chun Ping. I know I butchered that name, but I did want to talk about this movie, Femme, because it has really interesting character dilemmas that is brought out by amazing performances that really capture the feel of this scarring moment in these characters' lives. So, and just the conflict that is at hand with both of them. Like, it's such an interesting film to watch. Next up, Zoe Kravitz, Blink Twice. Really, like I said, when I mentioned this movie as one of my favorite thrillers, really impressed with this as a debut film. It's one heck of an impressive debut. Mike Cheslick for Hundreds of Beavers. You know, this is a fun film. This is a movie where it's like the experimentation and like the creativity behind filmmaking. This is the type of movies that inspire other filmmakers to make movies. Sometimes it's not really the budget. It's really the passion of just making something that's different. And Hundreds of Beavers is one of the most different films you'll watch this year or just in the last couple of decades, honestly. Then we have Sean Wang for Didi. I like these coming-of-age stories, and for a debut film, I thought this was really well told. But my favorite debut film had to go to Titus Kapar for Exhibiting Forgiveness. This is a movie that was unexpected. I decided to check this out in theaters. Not a whole lot of people ended up watching this movie, but you know, this was such an emotional film that it brought me to tears, and I don't think a whole lot of movies did that this year for me. As a debut film, I was very impressed with it. Next category is performances, and my favorite male performance this year had to go to Colman Domingo. When I saw this movie, it immediately became obvious to me. I was captivated by his performance ever since I saw that film, and watching these other award-nominated films, I still think that he's still right up there. For best female performance, I have to give that to Demi Moore. The Substance was quite something, and that movie, I mean, I'm sure that movie challenged her quite a bit, and it was a whole lot of fun watching her react to these scenes and just go completely bonkers. She was excellent in the film. And as far as ensemble performance, this was a difficult choice because I was considering like maybe challengers or something, but you know, at the end of the day, I thought which characters interacted well together and worked as a unit and held all the pieces together. And that movie had to go to Conclave. I think Stanley Tucci and Ralph Fiennes and all the other characters that are involved with this really make this the tense ride that it is. So Conclave, I had to give it to this movie because the characters are the selling point of this movie and keeping you invested, and they did an incredible job of that. Next category is score. I have a few movies to mention here, and one of them is Conclave, of course. I really enjoyed the score of this. I think, like I said earlier, it brought out that tension, that much needed tension in this drama. Then we had Challengers, of course. I mean, quite an energetic score. It was almost my number one. But my number one had to go to Dune Part 2. On second watch, I just kept thinking about that score more and more. And this is a movie that, of course, got snubbed at the Oscars. Apparently, it doesn't qualify. But, yeah. Not on this channel, it doesn't. Dune Part 2 was my favorite score this year. Challengers was so close, but I had to give it to Dune Part 2 because it's just so epic in scope, and it's just a score that I kept wanting to revisit even more so than Challengers. Next category is Best Editing, and I have two films that were kind of the standout for the year. Furiosa, the editing is what sells you on this action, and it's phenomenal. The energy is just through the roof with this film. Next up is Challengers. I think the editing is another selling point of this film. It is so incredibly well done. But my number one had to go to a movie that I was almost not even considering for a little bit, and then I watched it a second time, and then I'm like, wait a minute. What was I thinking? And of course, that movie had to go to The Substance. This movie has so much editing, and it is so effective to evoking reactions. It's a movie that's an experience, and that's thanks to many of the technical aspects of it that make it what it is. And editing just happened to be a great factor in making you experience all these uncomfortable moments. Next up, cinematography. Gladiator 2, really good cinematography. The Peasants, also very striking cinematography. Dune Part 2, an incredibly epic and just immersive film, and then the beautiful cinematography are just like the icing on the cake. Furiosa, also fantastic cinematography. But my number one film, you know, it's not as an epic film per se, but that's not to take away anything from its cinematography, which I think is incredibly strong, which was Conclave. It was a very difficult decision because these three titles are really neck to neck, and it's going to be changing constantly back and forth, but for right now, I'm going to say Conclave. I really like some of the shots, like, you know, like the umbrella scene shots, like I really like that, and it kind of reminded me of Foreign Correspondent a little bit. So I don't know, for now we're sticking with Conclave. Next category, Best Special Effects, and Twisters. I had to include that movie in this list because I think the effects were actually really good. The Substance, also really good effects. Practical, most of them, so that's even more impressive. Dune Part 2 had really good ones too, but my favorite had to go to Furiosa. For sound design, I had Gladiator 2, Strange Darling, Conclave, Dune, and Challengers. And of course, I settled with Furiosa, which had the best sound design. For the next set of categories, we're talking about best studio films. We'll start things off with A24. A24 had a good number of films this year: A Different Man, Heretic, Love Lies Bleeding, but my favorite A24 film had to go to Sing Sing. For Netflix, I had to give that to Hitman. This was the most enjoyable film on that platform that I have seen. Next up, Disney/Hulu. Honestly, I couldn't really name anything, but you know, if you're forcing me to pick a movie that more or less is solid, we're gonna have to give it to Inside Out 2. Like, it's not some incredible animated film or anything. I didn't even include it in my favorite animated films this year. But in terms of best Disney work, honestly, this is the only thing I could rack my brain for. Apple TV Plus, not much going on there. I mean, I know they have some decent TV shows, but in terms of movies, the only thing I saw that was more or less okay was Wolves with Brad Pitt and George Clooney. For Amazon, not a whole lot going on there either. I had to give that to Musica. Fun film, really like the editing and the ambition in the film. For HBO/Warner Brothers, just gonna hands down put it, Furiosa was my favorite from that studio. And then lastly, for Paramount, much like last year, there wasn't a whole lot of options. They don't really do a whole lot of movies, but they did have a movie that I really enjoyed, which was Smile 2. Definitely a surprising film for the year and one of my favorite horror films of the year as well. These were the movies that really shaped up the year to be what it was. An incredible year for many genres, and I'm sure that there's films that I didn't see that probably maybe should have been included in this list. I know I didn't get a chance to see A Better Man. That was like potential for to being a musical, maybe a biopic. Not too familiar with the movie, but that was getting a decent amount of reviews that were really good. So any movies you think I missed out or maybe should have included, please do comment them down below in the comment section. I'll be curious to hear what people's thoughts are on their own favorite films of 2024. And if you want to check out my top 10, which is a more comprehensive, like official top 10 films, do check out my top 10 on my channel. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching. As always, make sure to hit that like and subscription bar down below. And I will see you guys in another video.